Rape culture. It's a term that was coined in the 1970s in feminist circles, and that's where it remained confined until recently. Rape culture is associated with victim blaming, sexual objectification, and trivializing rape and sexual harassment. It's something we hear more and more about in war zones, but rape culture, many say, is all around us, in the advertising and entertainment we consume, and in the communities where we live. Welcome to McGill Talks. I'm Jacquie Rourke. This week, McGill Talks Rape Culture. Joining me to discuss, Shaheen Shariff is an internationally recognized expert on sexting and cyberbullying. She's an associate professor in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill. Shariff is also an affiliate scholar at Stanford University's Law School's Center for Internet and Society. Carrie Rentchler is Associate Professor of Feminist Media Studies in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill. She's the former director of the Institute for Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies. And Bianca Tétrault is the Harm Reduction Officer in the Office of the Dean of Students at McGill and a social worker. She's responsible for the implementation of Consent Week at the university and the incorporation of bystander intervention around sexual assault on campus. Thanks you all for joining us. This is a really important topic, not an easy one, but we're going to get some information from you based on all your work. Rape culture, it's always in the news lately, it seems, and again, very recently, an Alberta Provincial Court judge, throwing it back in the news with a comment saying to a 19-year-old woman who came before him in court alleging she had been raped, judge saying, why couldn't you just keep your knees together? Carrie, I want to start with you. That kind of a comment, is that part of rape culture?
Yes, most definitely. That's a direct example of rape culture, and I'm sorry that that young woman had to hear that, because what it does is it says you're responsible for what you've suffered, and it puts the blame and responsibility for the violence she suffered onto her. It also implies that she was asking for it, that she was asking to be sexually assaulted, and no one asks to be sexually assaulted.
So the term rape culture then, it's ignorant comments. Just give us perhaps a list so people understand it's not just the act or the crime itself, but it's much more than that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a term, as you mentioned, that comes from the 70s that basically was trying to explain the ways in which sexual violence is structural. That is, it's institutionalized. We have individual perpetrators, but we have systemic and cultural supports for their perpetration. So in things like rape jokes, in catcalls, things that are understood to be funny by the people who use them, but which actually tell those who are targets of sexual violence that they are violable, right? That they are targets of sexual violence. So it can go anywhere from like statements like that, or what we call microaggressions as well, things that say that women are devalued, all the way up to institutionalized forms of rape culture. Right, where people don't take serious the reporting of sexual violence and sexual assault.
Well, Bianca, you work in the Office of the Dean of Students, and you're charged with looking at what can be done in a university context about this kind of culture. Mm-hmm. Tell us, why is rape culture in a university context so particular and of such concern?
Well, we know that many of our students, our international students, come from other parts of Quebec and Canada, and so people who come to university for the first time are vulnerable. They don't have a large support group. They may not know the city at all. We know that there's a lot of partying that starts in the first year, so you're making new friends, you're building new memories, which is all great things, but unfortunately some people take advantage of that. And when we claim to think that we don't know what consent is, or we can't ask for what we want or our desires, is a real limitation when we're talking about building healthy relationships. So it's really important in universities to look at how we build these healthy, respectful relationships moving forward, because you'll be together for the next 4 years. And something so traumatic as sexual assault will impact you and the way that you experience your rest of your academic career as well.
And the rest of your life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, we're going to look at sort of the university context in a little bit and reporting in that question. But Shaheen, I wanted to ask you, the expert on cyberbullying, you take all of this and a culture that we live in, and then you throw technology on it. Is that like just pouring gas on a fire in terms of spreading it, in terms of providing content that can live on the web and live forever. What does the technology do in an environment of rape culture?
So I want to be careful. I want to make sure that we don't blame the technologies. The issue is, as Carrie has said, that it is rape culture is so embedded within the social norms, especially of the millennials, the kids that have grown up, the 3 generations that have grown up immersed in digital technologies and social media. So what's happening now is that all the way up to university aged, up to even early and mid-30s, social media and texting are the largest form of communications. And young people are the largest consumers of popular culture and media. If we're looking at rape culture in the university context, we have to be aware that it's not necessarily rooted in young people's norms, although it seems to have become normalized within their norms. But the influences come from adult modeling of rape culture, of these attitudes along the continuum.
It's a learned behavior.
Behavior. The problem is this: once it's on social media and once it's distributed through online, it becomes a permanent record, and it is saved on people's computers. It can be retrieved. It can be spread virally. And every time somebody is, for example, an intimate image, say a young teenage girl sends an intimate image of herself to a boyfriend in trust, and he's reassured her that he's not going to send it on, but to make his friends laugh or embarrass her, he distributes it online. That image then, every time it appears online or on social media or Instagram or wherever it's distributed, is a re-victimization of that young woman's experience. Now, talking about judges, we started with judicial attitudes. There was an example of a case in British Columbia where a young girl was gang raped after a rape. She was drugged and gang raped by some teenagers. And a 16-year-old boy filmed the rape, and instead of passing the film on to authorities, he passed it on to a friend to post on Facebook. At the time, the video spread so virally, and the only thing they could do was charge him with distribution of child pornography. But the sentence he got was, the judge asked him to go home and write an essay about the evils of the internet. So there again, you have somebody, a judge who is totally out of touch with the entire notion. And interestingly enough, in that case, the actual perpetrators who raped the young woman were not charged for a very long time because all the focus was on what happened online. So we have to be careful that we balance our attention to the physical aspects of sexual assault and sexual violence, as well as to the online incidents.
It seems that tracking, following up, is completely off people's radar. For example, the judge that I referred to at the beginning in Alberta, his behavior and making that very inappropriate statement to the young woman who'd come before his court, that was flagged by a group of law professors at Dalhousie and the University of Calgary. So it wasn't even an institutional review. They flagged it and said, how can this be? If judges are charged with applying things in the criminal code, such as the rape shield provisions, and they're not doing it, Carrie, what does that mean for the rest of society in terms of normalizing it and glossing over it? What impact do those kinds of things have?
Sure. I mean, I think when we see judges say these things, we begin to understand why more people don't report sexual assaults that they've experienced. And there's very few people who do actually report and actually make it into courtrooms for all kinds of reasons, because attention is drawn to the person who reports more than the person who has allegedly assaulted the victim. So all of this responsibility, scrutiny, looking at the survivor's behaviors, what she or he was wearing, all of that attention says, we don't believe you. We don't think this is serious, right? We think you're making this up, right? There's a lack of trust in what people who are reporting have to say. So from all the way down to those sort of first moments of like when a survivor tells someone a story about what happened, the first thing ought to be belief, right? But when we see in these very high profile cases, attitudes like this, which say, this was your fault, you were asking for it, we begin to understand why there isn't more reporting, right? And there's a lot of reasons why people don't report, right? Very valid ones. I'm not saying everyone should report either, because not everyone wants to.
Well, in a university context, they don't necessarily go to the police, they go to the administration. And Bianca, so you would be in the office where some of those people might come to file a complaint. Do they come? Are those complaints being heard, or are people staying away as well? Or can you know, really?
Well, we've definitely seen an increase in reports over the years, over the last 2 years for sure, with the increase in attention to what universities can do for their students, looking for alternative recourses and support services. Students want their universities to be held accountable for the well-being of their students and the way that they navigate their education and the environment. And so when we have universities in the US coming forward with Title IX, when we have the American White House Task Force put forward by President Obama to combat sexual violence in colleges and universities, undoubtedly Canada's following, and students want to see their universities follow suit as well. So yes, we are receiving more disclosures, but I think even going back to the judge and what you were saying about this, high-profile person presenting such a misconception, it really reinforces these myths, these false facts that people believe in all facets of our society, and increases barriers just not amongst peers, but at the university as well, because what I thought was true, but now what people are telling me isn't, has just been reinforced by this massive superior image.
What are some of the main myths that you've encountered that students buy into?
Oh, I mean, so many. And sometimes we think that that they're old myths, that we've kind of gone past these myths, but they're still around. So as simple as, what was that person wearing? You asked for it. Or because you said once before means you consent again. Where were you last night? What were you doing? These are all common questions that people will encounter amongst their peers, even when disclosing what has happened to them. So these myths are, although old, still very prevalent.
And do you find, so you're charged with, for example, Consent Week and all that, do you find that some of these efforts, to maybe explain what they are, have an impact, change behaviors, change thinking?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, and we're seeing that, I guess, primarily when we talk about Frosh. So Frosh is unique to McGill. It's a week-long party that occurs amongst faculty, so it's student-run. And so for the last 2 years, those who run Frosh have really recognized the importance of consent, and talking about consent, especially when we engage in alcohol use. And so all of the coordinators and leaders have been trained in consent education and bystander intervention, which is how to identify, interrupt, and support somebody affected by a potentially harmful situation. So we're seeing shifts and changes happening amongst our youth here at university.
What are the toughest issues to address in this age group?
So one of the biggest challenges is when we meet students who are telling us that they don't need to learn more about consent because they know all about it. They know how to have healthy, respectful relationships. But when we have students who come to us to disclose sexual assault, in their story they'll say, I told my friends, and then they asked me, well, why was I out with that person? Or what was I wearing? Or they know that guy, so he's a good person. It must not have been sexual assault. So in the consent campaign, what we're looking to do is to confront these very deep-rooted misconceptions, but that at some level are foundational work to creating an environment where culture change can happen.
Shaheen, you're embarking on a huge project that's going to examine rape culture. What do you hope to uncover, and how are you going to go about it, and what would you like to uncover? Because it seems like this is just so ingrained. I mean, how do you really change?
And that's actually a very good segue to our partnership project that we're putting together, involving a number of universities and women's advocacy groups and academics. And one of the things that we want to do is reclaim the responsibility of universities to do two things. One is to educate. I mean, we are the central, universities are there to educate. All of the recent examples covered by the media on rape culture in universities evidences that the universities need to do a better job of developing their policies that are aware and sensitive to human rights, to ensure that they have the appropriate processes in place, to ensure that they provide safe spaces for learning. The law, both in Canada and the US, provides for the fact that universities and schools as well are required to provide learning environments that are free of discrimination. And in fact, under Title IX, the case of Davis versus Monroe in the US said that institutions can sometimes create a deliberately dangerous environment by tacitly condoning and not doing enough to address these issues. So I'm delighted that McGill is taking this initiative. And also, a task force that looked into what happened at the Dalhousie dentistry school incident that is well known, well publicized in the media. And they found that restorative justice was the be all and end all. It did work to some extent, but it also happened to marginalize the main female who actually reported the incident to administration. And it also marginalized the so-called whistleblower from the group of 13 students who were involved in the Facebook page. So he was isolated, and they felt like they were pressured to participate in a process that made them really uncomfortable and isolated. So we have to create safe spaces for our students. So what are we doing in our project? Going back to what I said earlier, the fact that arts and popular culture and media and social media are great influencers of how young people communicate, we are bringing those sectors in to work with researchers and to develop curriculum engaging students, mentoring students, and providing them with opportunities to develop, to think about rape culture, their own social norms, the continuum of rape culture from joking and teasing and where it crosses the line to become harmful, illegal, and all of those things. We have actually art galleries involved, we've got theater companies involved. We want to even engage students from professions like dentistry and medicine and law that don't usually get this kind of social development opportunities to just even think about the thresholds of what they allow within their social norms.
It just seems so ingrained, though. It seems like, you know, it's in our advertising, it's in the way people speak to each other, as you've mentioned. Carrie, you've studied this throughout your career. What are they saying, activists, in terms of what really needs to happen to change mindsets out there? To me, it seems like the wall, the hurdle is massive.
It is, and it requires, I think, a number of different angles. It needs to involve lots of different campaigns and lots of different changes. I mean, I think what we're seeing, especially on university campuses around consent campaigns, around bystander campaigns, is they're good at changing attitudes, at least through surveys show that. But what you're describing is how do people actually change their behavior and learn to do things differently. So I think training needs to continue for students, but it also needs to go up the hierarchy in the university. And everyone needs to be trained, and everybody needs to act differently as well. I think when we see media telling stories differently, when we see hashtag campaigns like hashtag been raped, never reported by two journalists who'd never told anyone about the sexual assaults that they had experienced, speaking out after the John Gomeshi case. Here we have an example sort of in the media and picked up by the media by two people working in the media to tell a different story about rape culture. So I think we have lots of different stories about rape culture that challenge these myths, that demand accountability. And so what it is, it's listening to those demands.
So raising awareness is what we're doing, which is good. What do you think?
I think, sorry if I can interject, please. We're doing this through curriculum. We're doing this through the kinds of initiatives that Carrie is talking about, working with media, sensitizing media to less sensational reporting of these cases and actually more responsible reporting.
When you say through curriculum?
We're going to go into classrooms and develop modules where they can, students will actually engage in critical analysis of media narratives. They're going to go through media reports and engage in critical assessment and evaluation of those reports. We have to go deep because these issues are deep-rooted. They're rooted in discrimination, and they're intersecting and interlocking forms of discrimination, where you're looking at homophobia, you're looking at sexism, misogyny, you're looking at racism and intersectionalities of those.
Because you're going to put it under a microscope. You're going to put society under the microscope.
We're putting three sectors.
Okay.
Law and policy at the university level and the legal framework around it. We're looking at news and social media. So social media platforms, news media, and looking at, and the third one is arts and popular culture. And we're looking at each sector in terms of A, how they might tacitly condone and sustain rape culture through their systemic responses and their everyday reporting and that kind of thing. And B, looking at how we can mobilize these sectors to be proactive. Students are going to develop apps, they're going to develop videos, they're going to work with social media organizations. We've got some key social media organizations working with us to develop platforms, safe platforms. Within, we've got art galleries, for example, that will display student work, and that'll bring in the public into dialogues. There'll be dialogues at these art exhibits, which will be originated by students about their experiences with rape culture. So they'll be able to talk about their experiences. They'll be able to talk about consent and intent. And intent is another issue that I think is overlooked, because with this sort of focus on, well, I was just joking, I didn't intend to harm, the line, defining the lines for the millennials is very difficult, and often, and the notion of intent under criminal law is one that has to, they have to establish. But then the onus goes onto the person who reports the rape, because depending on how the judge interprets perceived intent of, by the perpetrator. So there are all these legal notions as well. Gossip and defamation. There's we're going to educate, and we want to develop legal literacy as well at the university level, as well as in universities and schools. There's a lot of work to do.
One of them is really breaking down the barriers to accessing supports and challenging those misconceptions that continue to fall through the cracks when people come forward to report, when they're sitting in class and they hear their professor make an off-comment joke about rape, sexual assault.
What do you do with that?
What we're trying to do is to create a place where people can talk about it in an environment where it's acceptable to talk about something that has affected you negatively without being told that you need to toughen up, or this is just the way that our culture is, or it's just a class, it doesn't matter. And so I kind of want to shy away from using the term safer spaces, but more so accountable space. So a student should be able to feel capable coming forward, talking about whatever has impacted them and being heard in a supportive way that's going to empower them to go forward.
But most students, if they hear a really inappropriate joke in a class, most students aren't going to go and report it right now, are they? I mean,
I don't think we can generalize. I think there's a large group of people who would actually say something. I mean, we have people who will do protests in class, who will go to access the dean of students, who will come to my office, who will talk amongst peers and other student faculties. So I don't think it's necessarily that somebody needs to stand up in class and say something directly to a student, to the professor, but that they'll go and utilize their resources where they know they're going to be heard. And so we want to model that image of being heard in all aspects of the university life. especially when we're talking about sexual assault.
So Carrie, we're hearing about a lot of studies and looking at what to do about it. What would you like to see done? And is there anything out there that is particularly effective that you think should be implemented right away?
I think there have been a number, I know there have been a number of reports from various universities in particular about what some of the best practices might be for responding to rape culture on campus. For instance, forming response teams whenever there's any report of sexual violence on campus. We could think about how that might include racist comments, right, or people making jokes within class. Maybe it doesn't require a whole team, but that there's some kind of very clear protocol in place. But I think all of our institutions need to be far more transparent and accountable, right, in terms of how are they being accountable. So we've had several cases recently with the RCMP, with the military, various universities as well. These are places that have to be held accountable, and they have to take seriously within their own spaces how they address sexual violence and the support for it.
But there's a need for a lot more research and a lot of opportunities, I think, to make a difference.
Thank you all very much. We could go on. Very interesting topic. I appreciate your time. Shaheen Shariff, Carrie Rentchler, Bianca Tétrault, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us next time, McGill Talks.